Hi, my name's Daniel. I'm currently the Special Collections Librarian for Monash University Library. What I want to do today is actually take you on a bit of a behind-the-scenes tour of what we affectionately call the Chill Zone. That is our closed collection. And what I want to do is share with you some of the gems from our comic book collection. Now, it might not have the glitz and glamour of a Swift collection of pre-1800 books and pamphlets, but in terms of print history as well as Australian culture and Australian popular culture, it is just as important. So this is the Chill Zone, and this is where we house the majority of our collections. So the closed collection is a controlled environment, and that means we look to regulate relative humidity as well as the temperature, and we do that to slow down the process of deterioration, but also ensure that the treasures of our collections are preserved for prosperity. So this is actually particularly important for materials such as comics, and in particular comic books and comic strips. As early comics were produced using newsprint paper, it's actually quite cheap, and it's not necessarily designed for longevity. It does use a lot of chemicals during that paper making and printing process. So the odor that you actually smell with things like old comics and pulps is actually the paper decaying. However, there are several things that we can do to actually slow down this decay. As you can see, we've taken several steps to ensure that we preserve these items for as long as possible. This includes placing them individually in polypropylene sleeves to actually, envelope them and ensure that they're not rubbing up against the other issues in the front and the back. And it also limits the amount of air that comes in to the box, that speeds up the decomposition process. You can see that we've created bespoke little boxes for our issues, and they're using archive standard board. Finally, as a final step of preservation, we hope to have these digitised with copyright permitting, of course. So most of the questions that I'm actually asked about the comics book collection is generally distilled into one word, which is why. Why do we collect comic books? Why do we consider them special? Why are they rare? And generally, it's given, we can give the same answer to any of the print material that we have. It doesn't have to be unique or rare to be considered special. It's been well documented, and from a historical perspective, that there's been a bit of a cultural snobbery with things like comics, so comic books and comic strips and graphic novels as well. They're often viewed as puerile or lowbrow, and they don't always fit into the purview of a lot of collections, and particularly special collections. However, I feel like over the past decade, the views on comic books and comic strips as social documents has evolved quite significantly. So, comic books are really social documents. I think we owe, particularly in Australia, we owe much of our idea of mateship and larrikinism, as well as, to some extent, our dry wit to comic books and its readership. Early comics, and particularly Australian comics, were really reflective of society at the time. So when you look at some of these earlier comics, you get the sense that there is a fear of the unknown. And that is fear of others, the otherness, so they're very much pro-isolationists, as well as that idea, I guess, that the modern idea of toxic masculinity and fragile femininity. So that you get sort of that those historical and cultural perspectives that really make the comic an important social document. It tells us what it was like to grow up as a child in that era. And in turn, it gives us a bit of a barometer on the cultural psyche through popular culture and readership as well. So welcome to the Special Collections Reading Room. This is where patrons, students, as well as the public come to view our Special Collections material. I brought you here mainly because it's a little bit easier to view the material as opposed to upstairs in the room. And in terms of the comic book collection, although we do curate international material, Monash University Library is actually particularly strong in early Australian comics that roughly span a period from 1920 to 1960. So when the first comic strip was actually created is a contestable issue. Associate Professor of History at the National University of Singapore, Ian Gordon, suggests that its first iteration is in the Smith's Weekly, However, there's a gentleman called John Ryan who is author of a textbook called Panel by Panel, which focuses on Australian comics. He actually dates it back to roughly 1859 in Melbourne's Punch. Melbourne Punch is much like its London counterpart, which was just called Punch. It was very much focused on using satire and humour to make a social commentary of the time. When we have a look at this one, it basically covers 12 pages, so you're not looking at that standard panel by panel comic strip. However, John Ryan suggests that this is sort of that first iteration where it uses illustration and text underneath over multiple pages to tell a narrative. So this story here is called The Great Moral History of Port Curtis in 12 chapters, and actually follows a gentleman called Mr. Toodles Jr. And he's a rich gentleman travelling to Port Curtis, which is sort of an outpost of Rockhampton in Queensland. And basically, as we follow through the story, he has troubles. He's prospecting. He's looking for gold. So he takes a significant amount of material with him. And what he finds is that his wealth doesn't actually make any difference. It doesn't place him in any better stead than the other prospectors. He's basically robbed by his colleagues on the goldfields, and eventually he ends up back in London, or back in England, where he vows never to undertake that again. Okay, so now we're going to jump forward to May 1907, and this is the first issue of The Lone Hand. The Lone Hand was just a publication of what is quite well known, the Bulletin, and its primary focus was on literature and poetry. The example that we have here, it's titled The Fight, and so for those of you who are familiar with Norman Lindsay, he's best known for his iconic piece, his children's literature piece called The Magic Pudding. Lindsay did illustrate a number of things for the Bulletin as well as The Lone Hand. And John Ryan from Panel by Panel actually argues that this is sort of the first example where an Australian artist systematically uses the comic strip medium. So when we actually have a look at it, it works, it flows in the same way that a comic strip or a comic book would. Obviously it omits the square panels, but when we have a look at it, it is very similar. So as you can see in The Fight, Lindsay does use that structure of a comic strip. The story which we have here captures two koalas coming to blows, those being Bill Wattleberry and Ginger Bluegum. The other characters there, his team, I guess you would call it, is a feisty possum as well as a little angry koala, and then it's adjudicated by a platypus. With a lot of these publications, they don't always make don't have any particular context or have any I guess sense of place within the publication. I mean, this sits opposite something called The Genesis of the Bulletin, being the memoirs of J.F. Archibald, so really has nothing to do with two koalas fighting. So we're going to move forward to the 1920s, and we're introduced to one of Australia's most well-known comic book characters, and that's Ginger Meggs. It was created by Jim Banks, and it was originally produced as a supplement for The Sun. So now we're going to move forward to 1931, and Ian Gordon has described this as the first standalone comic book. It's called The Kookaburra, and you'll see in the title it actually says the All-Australian Comic. As you can see by some of these earlier copies that we have here, they are deteriorating very quickly, and it's actually a good example of why we need to look after these comics, get them housed and then get them digitised so that we can refer to them in the future. So towards the latter end of the 1930s, Australia was starting to quickly be inundated with American and British imports and reprints as well. So one of the so it was sort of the Americanization of Australian comics. We have here the #1 Adventures of Buck Rogers, which was printed in New Idea in 1937. But we also have, I brought it out just for interest one of the editions of Amazing Stories by the godfather of science fiction, Hugo Gernsback, and that's where we first introduced to Buck Rogers. You can sort of see the transfer of characters from America to Australia. But it wasn't that Australia didn't have a comic book industry, it was just very small. We didn't have the population or the artists to really produce our own thriving industry. So we were sort of being inundated with these imports and reprints, and it wasn't actually until Great Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939 that we saw the possibility of Australia really thriving as its own comic book oasis. So due to the financial and economic impacts that comes with declaring war, the Commonwealth Government needed to actually preserve non-sterling currency reserves, that they needed that money to fund the war effort. And this meant the implementation of import licensing restrictions. And these were brought into effect by the government in November 1939. And what that meant for books and comics and magazines was that they actually prohibited importing these items as they were viewed as non-essential. What comes after that is affectionately known as the golden age of Australian comics. So sort of, between the period of 1940 and 1946, it really heralded the start of a standalone Australian-led comic book industry. And that created local content as well as utilising local industry as well. As I mentioned before, the new wartime regulations governed the release of newsprint, and that meant that they weren't able to produce continuing publications. And this meant that some Australian comic book creators had to be really creative with their publications. So one of the things I've got out here is that some publishers started adding the term Yank to their comics to let the readership, the young readership, know that these were American comics. But some were far more creative, and they went about circumventing those new restrictions, and particularly Frank Johnson Publications, or FJP, were one of the innovators in that area. So what we have in front of us now are the results of some of those restrictions and how comic book creators circumvented some of those limitations. So Mandrake the Magician is being replaced by Mudrake the Magician. Superman is being replaced by Super Duperman, and Flash Gordon is replaced by Speed Umplestoop, and Tripalong Hoppity the Fearless Texas Ranger replacing Hopalong Cassidy. So you see here that Australianisms are replacing Americanisms. It also demonstrates the dry Australian sense of humour and larrikinism, which really came to the fore in this period. The items you actually see in front of you were created by a gentleman called Emile Mercer, who was born in New Caledonia in 1901 but migrated to Australia in 1919. He actually did some work with some titles that we have sort of talked about already, so Melbourne Punch, Smith's Weekly and The Bulletin. And he became quite popular during that period, but it was during the early 1940s, which are the items you see now, where he arguably did some of his best work. He worked with Frank Johnson Publications, and he released some of these one-shot comics that meant that every book had to have a distinctive title. So Monash University Special Collections is really lucky to have a small archive of Emile's works, which we can see here. And Mercer really captured the quintessential Australian sense of humour by using, exaggerated parodies of well-loved American characters. And effectively what he's done is to mock America with his works. One of the lesser known yet highly collectible Australian wartime comic book creators is Moira Bertram. At the age of 16, she actually published her first comic book strip, Joe. The one that you see here, which is the same character Joe, is the cover for a 1944 issue of Tokyo's Secret Weapon, and still quite collectible, and for good reason. Her style and use of colour made her one of the most prolific and popular comic book artists of the time. She usually, in her earlier work, she employed strong female protagonists, but later on she actually did quite a lot of focus on romance. So that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed a very brief overview of the wonderful Australian comic collection that we have in Special Collections. We're always more than happy to talk to you about collecting or your collection, as well as your research needs or teaching needs. And we would love nothing more than to bring out, all of the really beautiful treasures that we have in Special Collections for you. Thank you.